On the last episode of the Pax Romana podcast, we talked about the Emperor Diocletian, his rise to power in the tumult of the 3rd century, and ultimately his power-sharing agreement with another emperor named Maximian. Diocletian and Maximian weren't related. They may not have even known each other very well, but their alliance became a kind of linchpin in a new system to rule the Roman Empire and move beyond the decades of civil war that had done so much damage. Diocletian and Maximian would have to come up with some pretty clever propaganda to sell this new alliance-based model of governance to the soldiers of the Roman Empire, especially if they wanted their reigns to last. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about both the propaganda that they put forward, but also an expansion of their alliance to include 2 additional men. 4 Roman emperors all at the same time ruling together in an alliance. This was called the Tetrarchy. Was this new system capable of rescuing the Roman Empire? We'll talk about it on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 79, the Tetrarchy. Listeners, before we get too far along in today's podcast episode, I just want to say I have set up a link to donate to the podcast. I don't make any money doing this, but this is something I've done almost every week for the past couple of years, and I have had a few inquiries about how folks can support the podcast in addition to subscribing, liking, rating, and reviewing the podcast, which of course you all can still do. So I decided to go ahead and just set up a donation link. You're welcome to use it if you wish. If you don't donate, I'm still going to produce the podcast for as long as there is interest. But I will say that if you've benefited from the podcast and enjoyed it, I want to make sure you feel like you can contribute. So go ahead and check out the show notes for the link to donate. And by the way, you can find my content also over on YouTube at Prof. CPE. You can just also type in my name, Colin Elliott, in the YouTube search bar, and you can subscribe to that channel. Finally, I will be set to appear in the coming week or 2 on the Bible and Archaeology podcast. That's on YouTube. I'll be talking about Julius Caesar, so you won't want to miss that either. All right, enough announcements for now. Let's get to today's episode. In the last episode, we detailed Diocletian's rise to power, and in many ways, he should have struck you as a typical 3rd century Roman usurper. He did not have an elite background, he wasn't even from Italy, but he used the military to forge a path to power, taking advantage of the death of his predecessor, solidifying support among the soldiers in his unit, and then mobilizing that loyalty into a side in a civil war in which he ended up victorious, conquering the Roman Empire and then appointing another man, Maximian, in 285 to rule the West while Diocletian focused on the Eastern Empire. And although those two didn't know each other very well, they cemented their alliance with a marriage. Diocletian gave Maximian his daughter to wed. They also traded names. Maximian became Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maximianus Herculius Augustus. You will no doubt notice the familiar names of Marcus Aurelius and Augustus in Maximian's new name. But the other thing the 2 emperors did, apart from a marriage alliance and some name changes, was adopting protector deities that had a relationship. These were Jupiter and Hercules. Jupiter, as you know from this podcast, was the chief Roman deity. He was, in effect, the kind of god of gods, and Diocletian minted coins showing himself and Jupiter with inscriptions speaking about Jupiter's divine protection of Diocletian. At the same time, Maximian minted coins showing Hercules, accompanied by inscriptions which spoke about the virtues of Hercules. As you might know from mythology, Hercules was a son of Zeus, and Zeus was equivalent to Jupiter. Jupiter/Zeus was the overarching planning visionary god, whereas Hercules carried out the will of his father on earth. He was a dutiful, obedient, and virtuous deputy of Jupiter. And that is probably how Diocletian and Maximian wanted to be seen among their soldiers and the broader public of the empire. These were both emperors, but their roles were slightly different. Diocletian was the senior figure, the planner, the founder of this new alliance-based system, and Maximian was loyal to him, able to carry it out, but he was not merely a man in the same way that Hercules was not merely a man. He was also an emperor, just like Diocletian. The analogy between Jupiter Hercules and Diocletian Maximian, of course, isn't perfect. It's not meant to be a one-for-one relationship, but it did translate in terms that Romans could understand the way in which a relationship like this might work. It gave it a kind of precedence and history, despite the fact that it was an entirely new way of doing things. The closest arrangement I can think of prior to this was Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. But those two had a much clearer connection in that they were adopted as the grandsons of Hadrian and the sons of Antoninus Pius. Diocletian and Maximian did not have that kind of relationship. And so the Jupiter-Hercules connection gave their alliance-based system a little bit more heft in the eyes of those that mattered. Both Diocletian and Maximian had to deal with military conflicts in their respective parts of the Roman Empire. As a result, neither of the men really spent that much time in the city of Rome. Maximian made his capital the city of Mediolanum, which is the modern city of Milan in northern Italy. This city was strategically located near the Alps, as well as the Rhine River, which allowed Maximian to face the stream of Germanic invaders that continued to cross in those places. As for Diocletian, he tended to spend his time in the Eastern Empire, cities like Nicomedia. Nicomedia, which is near the Bosphorus, offered a level of proximity to the Persian and Danubian frontiers, making it an ideal Eastern capital. He spent less than 6 months of his 21-year reign in the city of Rome, and that 6 months occurred entirely in a single trip. So for all intents and purposes, he was always elsewhere. Diocletian, despite not spending much time in Rome, the city became home to the baths of Diocletian, which were the largest public baths ever built in Rome, and it was in Diocletian's name that the Roman Forum was repaired. But almost from now on, Rome became less and less of an imperial capital. That shift didn't happen all in one moment, but the center of Rome diminished. The handouts of food and oil and wine slowed down, and eventually the city was, in effect, a kind of collection of wards with vacant spaces and streets in between them. And just to illustrate the diminishing centrality of Rome, there was a point in 293 AD when Diocletian and Maximian met in Maximian's capital city of Mediolanum. And when they met, a panegyric was written praising the emperors. And there's a telling section of the panegyric which goes as follows. The city of Rome sent the luminaries of her own senate, gladly sharing with Milan, then a blessed city, the appearance of her own majesty. In consequence, the capital of the empire appeared to be there where the two emperors met. Under the system that Diocletian was making, the persons of the emperors gained increasing importance. And since the emperors were military leaders, personally venturing with their soldiers, usually on the boundaries, then the center of empire also gradually shifted away from Rome. And as this panegyric mentions, essentially the capital was wherever the emperors were gathered at a given time. Rome certainly retained symbolic importance, but its practical importance was diminishing rapidly. And soon its centrality to the empire in broader terms would also go away. In AD 286, the neat, ordered plan for a two-emperor-led empire faced its first serious challenge, and that is the usurpation of Carausius, a naval commander who was tasked with securing the English Channel against Saxon and Frankish pirates. He rebelled declaring himself Augustus, taking command of the fleet that was there, as well as the legions in that area. He was part emperor and part pirate. On the one hand, he minted his own coins and challenged the imperial authority of Diocletian and Maximian. On the other hand, he seemed more than willing to sack Roman cities in the area. Because Diocletian was focused on affairs in the east, Carausius was Maximian's problem. But Maximian also had to balance the invading Germanic tribes that were coming across the Rhine, and he couldn't be both places at once. And so Maximian allowed Carausius to call himself emperor. He wasn't officially recognized, of course, but neither did Maximian immediately go after him. Instead, he focused almost all of his military resources on securing the Rhine frontier, and by 289 had done enough damage to the invading Germans that he was free to invade Britain. He attempted that invasion in 290, but his fleet was destroyed by storms, and Carausius remained a thorn in the side of the two emperors. At this point, the empire needed to evolve again. It seemed as though another evolution in governance was needed. Two men simply were not enough to rule the Roman Empire. It faced just too many foreign and domestic challenges. Invasions, rebellions, administrative burdens. There needed to be a greater division of power. So Diocletian and Maximian met in Milan in 293 AD, the event which that panegyric I mentioned earlier commemorated, and they formalized what would be called the Tetrarchy, or the Rule of Four. On March 1st of that year, two men, Galerius and Constantius, were promoted into the College of Emperors as Caesars. Galerius would be Caesar to Diocletian, and Constantius would be Caesar to Maximian. The idea here was that Diocletian and Maximian were the senior emperors, or the Augusti, and the other two men were the junior emperors. And when Maximian and Diocletian were finished, they would be succeeded by their respective Caesars. Just as with the appointment of Maximian, there needed to be some practical ties between the men. So Constantius was married to Maximian's stepdaughter, Theodora, and Galerius married Diocletian's daughter, Valeria. Both men, by the way, also adopted the name Valerius, so all four men shared at least one name. And then finally, the men divided the empire effectively into four governance zones. Diocletian took the Eastern Empire, which would be Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, and his capital was based in the city of Nicomedia. And then Galerius took the provinces along the Danube River, with his capital in Sirmium, affording him access to the frontier. Maximian continued on in the west, mostly though with Italy, Africa, and Spain, and he kept his capital in Milan. Constantius, who was Maximian's Caesar, took the most difficult western territories that were currently in rebellion, Gaul and Britain, and his capital would be Trier, which is in modern Germany. This doubling of the number of emperors ensured that Rome's rulers were stationed near critical frontiers and could respond rapidly to threats. Propaganda, however, was a little bit more challenging here. There was not an obvious divine relationship of four men where two of them are slightly above the other two men. That just doesn't really exist, to my knowledge, in Greek or Roman mythology. And so divine imagery was largely scaled back. Instead, we have numerous images from this period, both that appear on coins and statues, which emphasize the unity and the equality of the emperors. Probably the most famous is the porphyry statue of the Tetrarchs, which is still seen in St. Mark's in Venice. You'll know it by its purple stone. It shows all four emperors. It's impossible to tell who is who. They have the same haircuts, same faces, same hands on swords, same military armor, same cloaks, and they are embracing each other at the same time as well. Similarly, coins, despite bearing the individual names of the emperor that minted them, have many of the same symbols during this period. So it was possible to tell that Maximian or Diocletian or Galerius or Constantius minted the coin, it had his head and his name on the coin. But on the other side of the coin, there was an image that was the same across all the coins. In one case, for example, the emperors all sacrificing together at a military camp. And again, it's impossible in the image to tell which camp and which emperors are which. And I think that's on purpose. The idea here is that this is a true alliance. This is not a continuation of the crisis of the 3rd century where we have multiple emperors that are fighting. No, we have multiple emperors now that are in alliance and they are ruling the empire in the best way possible. But in some key ways, the men actually weren't united. The two new Caesars, for example, were different in one crucial way. Galerius was a staunch traditionalist in terms of his religion, and he was gung-ho about persecuting Christians in the empire. Constantius, however, who had been in the military a long time and was more accustomed to some of the new mystery cults that soldiers followed, including Christianity, the other problem in the Tetrarchy, apart from religious divisions, was the fact that both Maximian and Constantius had sons. And it was an open question as to whether those men felt entitled to rule Rome, either with their fathers or after their fathers died. The Tetrarchy was meant to be a kind of meritocratic system, but it would be very difficult to impose such a system when young, ambitious sons expected to be able to succeed their fathers. So the Tetrarchy projected unity and fidelity. It projected virtue and it inspired military loyalty, but it also had some cracks, even as it was being founded. But as a pragmatic project, I'd say that it generally worked. For example, Constantius was able to take over the fight in Britain while Maximian stayed and dealt with the Rhine border. And Constantius was victorious in defeating the usurper Carausius, and then a second usurper in Great Britain, and by 296, Constantius ruled Britain without any usurpers. Mission accomplished. At the same time that Constantius was taking care of business in Great Britain, Galerius was able to fight in Persia. Now, he wasn't very successful, and he needed help from Diocletian, but because Galerius was just one of 4 emperors, the pressure to defeat Persia and also deal with a bunch of other threats was not solely on his shoulders. And he was able to win enough victories to intimidate the Persians into a peace agreement in which Armenia was put once again under Roman control, and the Tigris River became the boundary between the two empires. This was ultimately a Roman victory. So, Britain could be pacified at the same time that another emperor could deal with Persia. And even at the same time as those two things were going on, Diocletian had to deal with Egypt, besieging the city of Alexandria because a revolt and a usurper had cropped up there. And again, because Diocletian didn't have to worry about what was going on in Persia and Great Britain and along the Rhine and the Danube, he was able to focus his efforts on Alexandria and bring it into submission. And by the way, there's kind of a funny story about that revolt. When Diocletian besieged Alexandria and it was clear that he was going to gain access to the city, he proclaimed that there would be a massacre. He would let his soldiers kill, murder, and pillage in the city until the rivers of blood in Alexandria came up to the height of his horse's knees. But as Diocletian marched his horse into the city, the horse stumbled, its knee falling and hitting the ground. As a result, Diocletian honored his word. With the knee of the horse touching the ground, this meant that no blood would be spilled. And the Alexandrians erected a statue in honor to Diocletian's horse. For the most part, the Tetrarchy worked, and we have here a major shift away from the system of the Principate, which would never return. These men were not first citizens or the first among equals or pretending in any way to preserve republican traditions. This was rule by a dominus or a lord. These men were, in effect, regional, absolute monarchs who ran a militarized system of government. And on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast, we will talk in more detail about what this militarization meant. Diocletian and his co-emperors organized the entirety of Roman society as military commanders. They were less interested in arcane systems of law or the workings of economics or the kinds of cultural and religious freedoms that had existed prior. No, these were men who were used to simply speaking a command and seeing people carry it out. But that is not the way that people or systems work. And the militarized society of the Tetrarchs, when implemented at scale, created serious disturbances in the Roman Empire. What exactly happened? Well, we'll talk about that on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.